It's live. Okay, cool. All right, I think we're rolling. If I could see that going. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, for everyone out there in internet land, welcome to the Business Podcast Mastermind. This is a fun and educational group started with a few talented friends in the business and podcasting space. We expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience can join. And we have a few people hanging out here today as their sort of hosts on this journey. I'll call out each of us, and then we'll get rolling with our guests today. First of all, I will give an intro here to Henry Lopez, serial entrepreneur, small business coach, host of the top-rated How of Business podcast, dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. And we also have Mark Hayward, who's from the Absolute Business Mindset podcast. He successfully left corporate America from a consulting firm, and again, we're pretty impressed with his ability to be an entrepreneur. He does things in real estate and has his own entrepreneurial endeavors, which go pretty well. So that's us here, kind of hosting things. And I'll give an introduction to our guest today. His name is, how do you like to say your name, your last name, Andrew?
It's Alleman.
Alleman. Okay. Yeah, relatively straightforward. Yeah. So our guest today is Andrew Alleman, and he is the founder of podcastguests.com, which connects podcasters with experts that want to be a guest on their podcast. Over 30,000 people subscribe to that service. Think of podcastguest.com like Haro, which is helpareporterout.com, a publicity service, but for podcasters. Andrew is passionate about niche media. The world of online news and information is quickly changing, and niche media publications and websites published by recognized authorities are becoming more important. In addition to his podcasting endeavors, he creates and/or manages and supports niche media websites. He also founded Domain Name Wire and Stacy on IoT. Domain Name Wire is an online publication catering to the domain name industry. The publication has been cited by the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, NPR, and New York Times, and other major on podcast newsletter all about the fascinating world of the Internet of Things. He manages sponsorships for the website and podcast, which is downloaded more than 100,000 times every month. Andrew, welcome to our group. How you doing today?
Thanks. I'm doing well. I don't think I wrote that. I think your partner wrote that, but he grabbed a lot of information. I hate like pumping my chest and that sort of thing. Kind of listening to it, I'm like, ooh, wow. But yeah, so yeah, no, it's great.
Got a lot to live up to here.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, bios are always fun. They give us a chance to actually reflect on everything that we've done and accomplished.
Right.
It's always heads down and looking forward. Otherwise. So
exactly.
Appreciate the chance. But yeah, anything else you want to tell us about yourself up front before we jump into some questions?
No, I've been podcasting myself for, let's see, I just published episode 369 today. It's a weekly, so call it 5-6 years. I guess more like 7 years, right? So I'm doing coming up on 7 years, 6 to 7 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I love the space. Even before that, I was doing, what do they call it? Internet radio, which is basically podcasting back in the day. So a big fan.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's too bad, Rob Greenlee, he's been a regular co-host with us throughout the years here. But he's been away lately for whatever reason. We're not quite sure. He had a surgery and stuff like that. But you'd identify with him because he's kind of been in it also kind of from the beginning. He was really an OG and
well, yeah, I wouldn't call it 6-7 years OG,
No, but I think having that long-term commitment and experience and doing, I don't know what Henry would say about it. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just going to. But even though I wasn't podcasting back in, let's say, like 90, was like 2007. which isn't like the oldest of things. I was very interested in podcasting and very interested in blogging and these spaces and watching them closely and like trying to get involved and all that stuff. So I think there are those that kind of just jumped on the bandwagon when it becomes popular, and those that have kind of been nerding out on the space for a while. You seem like you're falling the second category, but you can counter that. You're being modest today, so that's fine.
Were you asking Henry or myself? Sorry.
No, Andrew, you go ahead first, and
It's
we can
interesting
ask Henry.
because I started blogging in 2005. I started Domain Name Wire there, and I had Matt Mullenweg, the creator of WordPress, on my podcast, and he's like, that was really early days for WordPress. He's like, I mean, that was really, really early. At the time, it didn't feel like it, but then, as time passes and everything explodes, I mean, kind of like with podcasting, like you feel like you're late to the game sometimes. And then just this medium explodes like podcasting has. And we saw that over the past 2 years during the pandemic, right? I mean, I think we've all seen just this massive interest in people starting podcasts, wanting to get on podcasts, that sort of thing. The downloads and such has changed from the pandemic and people's listening habits, but just a massive interest in it just over the past 2 years, right? So you just look at, what percentage of people got introduced to podcasting in the past 2 years. I'm sure it's a really high percentage of people still active in it. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Henry, well, tell us. I'm not sure I know exactly your full history and the concept of podcasting.
I didn't launch till 2016. So for me, that's a long time ago, but it certainly was not early days. And podcasting really didn't come onto my radar until maybe a year before that we were talking about it, myself and my business partner at the time. So I think that's a long time ago, but obviously guys like Andrew and Rob have been around so much longer than that. So they're definitely pioneers compared to me.
Mm-hmm. Mark, I know you started your podcast relatively recently with the past couple of years, but how long has podcasting been on your radar? Like, were you there kind of watching it?
Yeah, so my sort of, it all aligns with my personal development journey, which started about 2008 or 9. So I started
before that. He was very underdeveloped.
So I started.
He was in school.
Audiobooks and started listening to podcasts and really immersing myself in business, personal development, and it really started from there. So I didn't start until December 2017. So it's like not that long ago, but for me it was developing skills, learning things, and building an audience from there. So I knew about podcasts, really interested in them, listened to them a lot, but it took me a little bit of time to get ready and get up for doing something, committing to podcasting long term, which is what I decided once I started.
Right. Andrew, let's go back and talk to you a little bit about your history here. Several projects that you're involved with here. You're clearly an entrepreneur. We heavily identify with entrepreneurs here in this group, of course. What's your history in sort of entrepreneurship? Is this something that goes back to grade school slinging candy or something?
Yeah. I was that kid in grade school. For sure, breaking down the packs of now and laters and that sort of stuff and selling them off by the piece. But yeah, I would say, it really kicked in college. I was in college in the late 90s. So .com boom was really going on. And for the first time, you could create, a website fairly easily. So I say that in that now it's insanely easy and costs very little money. Back then you had to go buy software to create, your website, like literally on CD-ROMs. And you had, domain names were kind of expensive. Web hosting was kind of expensive. There were no e-commerce packages out there, right? That was like hundreds of thousands of dollars if you wanted to get into that. So I really got into it when I was in college and started registering domain names, creating some websites, selling off some small websites. But then I went into working for others for a little over 5 years before I kind of broke out on my own and started doing the startup stuff. And then, so I mentioned earlier, Domain Name Wire. I started that site back in 2005 as a hobby, kind of a side project, because of my fascination with domain names. And then over time, people contacted me and said, "Hey, can I advertise on there?" And I said yes. And then so we would kind of, and it kind of grew from there. And then I added my podcast is about domain names too. I added that on, so I guess around 2014 maybe. And that was kind of my second iteration after doing a radio type program for a few episodes. But and then a couple years into that, I started podcastguest.com to solve a problem I was having myself, which was finding interesting guests for my show. And so that's kind of brings me kind of closer to today, where now I'm running Podcast Guest, Domain Name Wire, and then helping my wife with her podcast and newsletter as well.
Cool. Yeah. Interesting evolution. And I think I identify with this piece of it of just having my life and my entrepreneurship and just the way to see the world defined by kind of the tech that's evolving at the time,
Right. I mean, if I remember creating my first e-commerce site, and it was probably 2001, 2002, and trying to, as someone who doesn't code, as someone who's not technical, trying to create an e-commerce site back then, unless you had the budget to spend lots of money hiring someone to do it, was extremely, let's put it this way, the site was fairly crude in its design and shopping cart and that sort of thing. And now you can be less Shopify. So it's that has progressed the past a little over 2 decades.
Yeah, I don't. You're probably not aware, but my new podcast that I'm doing is in the NFT space, and that's been really interesting to kind of draw analogies between that and blockchain and the development of the web, and it's Web 3, right? We went through the web, we went through Web 2.0, maybe around 2010 or something like that, and people are saying, okay, this is Web 3, right? And I think there's a lot of similar opportunities in making things easier, right? Like, yeah, you can do a lot of things if you have a lot of technical knowledge and you're really nerdy about it, but a lot of the business opportunities here are in facilitating, can I set this up in a day or an hour?
I have so many friends who got in on those Bored Apes early. Oh man.
Oh yeah?
Bored Ape Yacht Club, yeah. And oh man, they're all like, going around on their, spending all their free cash now, all their funny money. So that's an interesting space for sure. So the NFTs. So yeah. But yeah, it is interesting. The interesting thing about that is when you get in earlier, when it's harder to do, that's where a lot of the opportunity is, right? Because you're early in the game. And we've seen that with blogging and then podcasting. It gets easier and easier. It's easier to start a podcast now than it was 5-6 years ago, right? There are plenty of guides out there on what you need to buy, the equipment. There are, plenty of coaches out there. There are people that will edit it for you. There are lots of them out there, right? So a lot more people in the space. But it's more crowded now, right? It's still not crowded in my opinion, but it's a lot more crowded than it was 5 years ago. So it can be harder to rise to the top. And we see that with blogs that started really early. We see that with podcasts that start really early. If those same people were going to try to do that today, it'd be a lot harder for them to build an audience. But I do still think, I sent out an email to my podcast guest subscribers Friday. I do think it's still not a crowded space when you look at the medium compared to other media, blogging, YouTube channels, that sort of thing. I mean, those are massively crowded. Whereas, depending on whose stats you look at, they're between say 300 and 700,000 active podcasts. I guess Libsyn's data is half of those have fewer than 200 downloads per episode. So even if you get into the thousands of downloads per episode, you're kind of a top podcaster at this point in the game.
Right, that's true. And I keep saying the way that I see podcasts, especially after running this group for a couple of years here and all the patterns that we're seeing, it's really just an audio version of your website. So saying that well, not like you have a website and you create an audio version. It is like the concept is similar to a website, meaning just like a website can serve multiple purposes, right? Like we can have NBC.com, we can have McDonald's.com, or we can have yourlocalplumber.com, and it's equally useful to have that website as it is to have McDonald's.com. And you can have websites for niche areas, niche businesses, niche topics, and nobody's going to say the website space is crowded. Don't get into it, right? It's more like, hey, have a website. It's kind of a no-brainer for these particular purposes. If you don't need a website, you don't need one. But if you want to do XYZ, hey, start a website, right? That's a no-brainer.
Right. Yeah. Thinking through that a little bit too. I mean, people like to consume content in different ways. And it always amazes me, like I've been blogging for 16 years now, right? And I'll go to a domain name conference and some people will come out to me and are like, hey, I love your podcast. They don't even go to the website, right? All they do is listen to the podcast. Whereas a lot of people are like, oh, podcasts, I don't want to listen to that. I'm that way on video. My podcast editor sends out these 3-minute videos with updates on, his service. I'm like, dude, just put it in writing. I want to scan it, be through this in 30 seconds. So people just like it in different ways. And I think we have to embrace all these different media. And that's one of the reasons I branched from blogging to podcasting is I saw so many people that had popular blogs that just, kind of social media kind of decimated them and people just moved on to different things, whether it was podcasting or that sort of thing. And so I think you need to look at all channels when you're thinking about a media company, a small media company, if you will, or promoting yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really good points. And each channel has its advantages, disadvantages, leverage points, things like that, ways of growing and changing. We have our ideas among us of like kind of what are the powerful leverage points of podcasts and maybe the diversity of use cases and leverage points of podcasts. But it'd be useful just to kind of hear your opinion. Like, can you share some maybe counterintuitive things or things that people might not be hip to yet about the leverage of a podcast or kind of the leverage points?
Yeah, I think, so there are a few things here. Both my wife and I had audiences when we started podcasts. So it was really helpful, right? We weren't trying to build our audience strictly from podcasting. As you know, discoverability is still horrible for podcasts. Podcast search is really bad on Apple Podcasts, that sort of thing. And it's not like where you can write something and then Google picks it up. And if someone's searching for a particular keyword in there, they can find your stuff. So it's challenging there. So of course that's helpful going in, having an audience already. But when I think about why people start a podcast, the one that makes me cringe is when people say, I'm going to start this podcast. It's going to become huge and I'm going to sell advertising against it. Because as you all know, that's the hardest thing, right? Everyone thinks they're going to take off and you have to get so many to have real advertising, right? Making it meaningful. You have to get a lot of downloads. So I tell people the reasons to start it, growing your own brand, right? So, talking about your type of business, to get people interested, knowing who you are, growing that brand. Of course, having guests on that you wouldn't ordinarily get to talk to if you picked up the phone and called them. Is another great thing. If you just ask someone, hey, can I talk to you for 30 minutes to pick your brain? They'll probably say no, especially if it's someone you don't know. But if you're like, hey, I'd love to introduce you to my podcast audience, can you come on for 30 minutes and I can ask you questions? Then all of a sudden they're excited, right? So I think those are some of the benefits to it, growing your own brand, getting to meet new and interesting people from it. And I think there, even if you have a small number of downloads per episode, you're still getting value from it. And so I have ads on my podcast, but they're the same advertisers I have on my blog, right? And it's not a lot of money. My wife's, we combine her podcast, newsletter, and website into packages. And what's interesting there is the advertisers, some of them are like gung-ho on the podcast, but not on the newsletter and website. Others are really into the newsletter. rather than the podcast. And so there's kind of an interesting mix, right? Like a lot of them say, hey, can you unbundle this? Which would be a pain. So we don't. But I think that if you make podcasting part of like just one channel amongst something, I think that's easier too, because then you're promoting them through your other channels. So I kind of went a little bit off from what you were saying there, but
That's great info.
The one like CPM based advertising is the death of podcasting, in my opinion. I just don't think many podcasters can really make that happen. And if they do sell ads, I would never do it based on CPM. I would do it based on you're sponsoring the show or having a partnership here, as opposed to, you're paying so much per 1,000 downloads.
Yeah, I heartily agree with that. And we talk about that quite a bit, just about the nicheness of your audience. Henry, we use this example over and over again. He had a car wash podcast, right? It's like, and it's easier to get the CPMs for a small audience podcast that's very directed towards a specific audience than sometimes it is to get a sort of more general audience podcast that
Absolutely
has a larger actual number of downloads. Yeah.
It's like that in advertising in general, online advertising in general, I would say. And, that brings up a great point that Pat Flynn mentioned one time, which was he was talking to a podcaster who had a couple hundred downloads per episode and was ready to give up because he thought it wasn't that much. And he said, well, picture yourself in front of an audience every week of 200 people, in an auditorium. Would that be interesting to you? And the person said yes. And he's like, okay, well, that's effectively what you have. And getting back to that car wash example, man, this is something I tell people that are looking to get booked on podcasts. A lot of times they're like, well, how many downloads does this podcast have? And I say, well, how many relevant people are in the audience, right? I mean, if you sell a product or service to car washes, or you're a car wash consultant and you can get in front of 100 people on a podcast, that beats getting in front of 10,000 people on an untargeted podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we on our Edge of NFT podcast, we have a Discord that I'm slowly but surely getting used to using Discord. And it's a bit of a headache just because it's sort of like a new form of social media for me, or whatever you want to call it. But it's actually interesting. We have about 400 plus people in there as sort of like registered members of it. Activity sort of increased for a little bit, then it sort of leveled off, and then I've been trying to pump it up a little bit more and get things going in there. And there's one woman who just started engaging, and it's fascinating. I just listened to the podcast. Cool, like this, this person said this and this person said this, and here's an idea that I had, and here's this, and she's writing a novel, of everything that's going on for her when she's listening to the podcast. And it's fascinating because, like you said, people are getting excited at that level, but you don't even know it.
Right.
Like if you don't have some sort of form of communication around it, right? It's fascinating.
In my opinion, is the most intimate of the channels out there right now, and I use that word to mean,
I missed the word. Sorry, I was clear my own.
Sorry.
Intimate. Yeah.
And that, not in, of course, the romantic sense, but in the sense of this is a long form conversation with someone. On YouTube videos, they're typically 2 or 3 minutes, and then people stop listening. Blogs, blog posts, news stories read 3, 4, 5 minutes. Podcasts are this long form, right? And it's something that is, I think, a lot of people underappreciate. A lot of people have figured out lately, right? But is that, it's an opportunity to tell a story and go more in depth. And before podcasting, you just had, you had like the NPR type interview shows, like the Fresh Air, that, 20, 30 minute, heavily edited interview type thing. Whereas now we have those, it's on demand and anyone can do it, which is really pretty cool when you think about it. And, I think that's why we saw an explosion over the past couple of years of people getting into podcasting, because they were no longer going to trade shows, right? They were no longer having those in-depth conversations with people they were meeting, and they were looking for new ways to do that. And I think podcasting served that need for a lot of people.
Yeah, agreed. I want to open it up to questions, and comments from Mark and Henry here. And Sunil, I know you joined a little bit late. You're welcome to come on video, audio at some point. There's no obligation. You're also welcome to put comments or questions in the chat. basically the way this format works here, I start out things with the questions, and as we proceed, we end at the end of the hour, but before that, it starts to open up more and more to the group. So, but my last sort of directed question here is, since you have your own personal angle on podcasting, you're dealing with podcast guesting, you're probably encountering a lot of podcasts, a lot of podcasters, you're seeing trends, things like this. I guess it's two questions. I have a lot of questions. I don't want to be greedy, but maybe I'll have time for the other one if not. But here's sort of the two questions. One, power users. Like, who's getting the most out of your podcast services? Like, are you able to see that? And number two, just general, like, what have been your kind of coolest use cases you've seen in podcasting, right? Like, oh wow, this person's really blew it up and I couldn't believe it, or this is how they did it, or stuff like that.
Right. So as far as power users, like, are you talking about like mypodcastguest.com service?
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I've seen, it's a two-sided marketplace, right? So you have podcasters and then you have guests, and a lot of times they're the same people, right? Because the number one way to grow your own show is to be a guest on other shows. So, I see a lot of people who are really smart around it. One person came up to me at Podcast Movement this past summer in Nashville, and I had my shirt on. He's like, "Hey, Andrew, let me tell you how much value I've gotten out of this, right? And here's what I do, right?" And so for him, it was getting booked on other podcasts, and for him, it was pitching smartly to podcasts rather than just spraying out there as many, throwing it against the wall and seeing what sticks, right? He was like, "Hey, let me reach out to the ones that are a great fit, and I will write a customized pitch to them," right? But then also on finding guests for his show as well, he did a lot of outreach there, and I think that onto it, not just a game, it's a game, and I think the people that do the best with it understand that, and then you also have to get over your fear or dislike of rejection, because there's going to be a lot of it. And you shouldn't take it personally, right? It's asking someone to be a guest on their podcast, especially if they get a lot of requests. Maybe they had a guest like you recently, and that's the reason that they don't want you on. It's not a personal thing necessarily against you. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great answer. Just kind of, it's a pattern that I've seen. There's always these temptations, and I'm sure there's useful ways to do it, to use the power of, for lack of a better word, computers to like do things at a large scale, whether that's message people, right, book people,
Right.
like, I don't know, all these things. But I've definitely seen this pattern of, yeah, you could do that, but like, counterintuitively, or maybe because that's been used up to a certain degree,
Right.
actually targeting who you're going to talk to, developing a very clear custom message, showing them that you care and that you're connected with them, may be actually way more powerful than this sort of blanket method.
Yeah, two things to follow on to that. I think that the most expensive part of you being a guest on podcasts is the time actually doing the podcast. So you certainly want to make sure you're going on ones that will have value to you in some way or another. I tell people to go on shows to build up their experience being on shows too, right? But what was my second thought there? I had a second thought and I lost it. I might come back to it. If I think of it,
that's right.
I'll jump.
Yeah. No, we were just talking about like, I'm blanking too. Let's open it up.
Move on, and if we think of what we were thinking,
we're all in we're still in our hangovers from New Year's Eve.
Right, exactly.
Get a break here. I want to open it up to Henry and Mark, because I know you guys probably have something to say, and we don't want to hog
and actually, before I get into a podcast question, I'm curious, how many domains do you personally own?
I have
that you just have parked,
1,800, I think.
Yeah.
So
wow.
I'm a small fish in the people I swim with, in the pond I swim with. At 1,800,
Wow.
I'll tell you that. So
Wow. Yeah, it was up to like a couple hundred, but
I came across a service called Name Silo, which I was excited about, because like you can renew them a lot cheaper than other places, and it seems like geared towards people who do domain name Do you like that site? Do you just use like?
I'm very familiar with it. I don't personally keep my domains there. But yeah, there are a lot that are less expensive than, some of the big names out there. So I encourage people to shop around. So
Cool.
Is that the kind of some of the advice I could find on your site or in your show? Do you
yeah,
provide guidance there?
Yeah, it's very insider baseball. But yeah, so we'll talk about different companies like GoDaddy and Name Silo that you mentioned, Namecheap, some of these bigger players and smaller players out there. We talk about legal issues. We talk about big domain sales. My podcast today is 22 people in the industry giving their predictions for 2022. So yeah, it's most of the people that listen to my podcast and read the site are either people that buy and sell domains, the companies that service them, like domain registrars and marketplaces, a bunch of the lawyers and service providers around the space, kind of brand owners, that sort of thing.
Interesting. So kind of segue off of that, any thoughts or tips for podcasters as to what, the rule I've always followed when I'm building a business is I want a domain that matches the business name as closely as possible. I want the .com at a minimum. Any thoughts, especially from a podcaster's perspective? I know for me, my website has been, from my analysis, critical to the growth of my show. The SEO that I've gotten over time is one of the number one things I can point my finger to attribute to the growth. But as it relates to that and domain names, any thoughts there for podcasters?
Yeah, I mean, the general rule is still, get as close of a match to your brand as you can, and in .com, right? So that's the general rule, and make sure it's something that passes what I call the radio test. I guess we could call it the podcast test now, right? Which is if you hear it, you don't see it. Can you remember it, and can you spell it to type? Years ago, everyone was leaving vowels out of their domain names, right? And so then you have to basically go to Google or try to remember it rather than typing it in. So something simple, 2 words, 3 words is okay if they're short, that sort of thing. But with podcasts, it's kind of interesting for some people. I think there's an opportunity here. There are all these new extensions, and I say new, they've been out since like 2014. Like I think .show one. There's like .audio, .inc, all these different extensions. And so some of them might be kind of interesting to use depending on how you're going to use your domain name. One of the challenges to using a non.com is people oftentimes remember it as having a .com on the end. And this is particularly a challenge with email. Because if someone sends an email to the wrong person, that's bad news. It could have personal sensitive information in there. So one thing I think that's interesting is if you have a main website on a .com and then you want to have a separate one for your podcast, and maybe you can't get the domain you want in .com, is picking one of these kind of fun extensions, right, to go with that. Like .fun is literally an extension, but thinking to the NFT space now, .xyz has become really popular on blockchain sites. Square just changed its corporate name to Block and is on block.xyz. And so there are a lot of fun things you can do there. You just need to be aware of the risks of confusion with anything that's not a .com. And this is very US centric advice. I should mention in some countries, people prefer their country code extension, right? Where like in Germany, you're more likely to see a .de than a .com. In the UK, you'll see a lot of .uk mixed in there with .com. So, if you have a show, a lot of people like .tv if there's an actual video element to it. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying, still the standard advice is .com, exact match, make sure it's easy to spell and remember. But it's kind of slowly, I would say this year is the first year where we've seen a lot of kind of larger, new and interesting companies adopting these non.com domain names. By this year, I mean 2021, last year.
Interesting. All right, then I'll ask this big, broad question that will lead to a lot of discussion. But from your perspective and experience, you've mentioned a couple of things. What makes for a good podcast show?
Yeah, so I think consistency to me is important as both a listener, and so I like to bring that to delivering a show as well. So for me, it's okay, this show is going to come out at this time every week. So as a listener, I know, hey, maybe I can make this part of my routine, right? So a lot of people are like, okay, this show comes out Monday, so this is my Monday afternoon drive home type thing, right? So consistency there. And I like to keep a consistency in length too. Now, the perfect length, a lot of people try to say, here's the perfect length. To me, it's a consistency, right? I don't want to be 30 minutes one week and an hour and a half the next. Because people, again, they're expecting a certain thing. They're expecting I can listen to this when I work out, or I can listen to this on my commute. And so to me, there's a consistency there as well. I personally, on my podcast, I start out with about 5 minutes reviewing news from the past week in the industry and telling people they can learn more by going to my website. And then I have an interview that lasts about 20 to 25 minutes typically. So, my full run time is usually between 30 and 35 minutes. Interviewing is a tricky thing, right? So there are good interviewers and there are bad interviewers. I kind of put myself somewhere in the middle, right? I'm still learning. The worst podcasts I've been on as a guest are the ones where the interviewer ends up talking more than I do, and giving their own experiences. I mean, it's good to have some of that going, some of that rapport, but you listen to, a good show, a good popular interview show on TV or the radio. And, the job as an interviewer is to lead and prompt. It's not to give a monologue. And so I think it's important as an interviewer to step back and kind of lead that conversation, but do that by giving the prompts, not the answers in your own. Occasionally, it's good to add your own kind of color and agreement, but not to go overboard with that.
It's a balancing act there because, my thought on that, and I'd like your further thoughts, is one of the reasons I'm doing the podcast, as we've already spoken to, is to position myself as an authority on this particular topic. So I'm not a journalist, right? I'm not a completely subjective bystander in the conversation. I need to interject at some point throughout.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
That's a good point. And I appreciate you bringing that up, Henry, because I come at this from kind of a journalist standpoint, and so does my wife. And I think that there's also kind of that roundtable thing where your guests are more in it with you as part of a conversation. And in that case, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, you're one of two or three type people. But yeah, there is a balance there too. You don't want to invite someone on your show and then have them speak 10% of the time and you're speaking 90% of the time. So it's a really good point. And it depends on what the purpose of your podcast is and what your listeners are expecting. Yeah. Right. So again, it's about meeting your listeners' expectations. So you don't want that to change from week to week. You don't want a week where it's 90-10 and the other time it's 10-90, right? On how much you're talking and how much your guest, if you have one, if you're doing it.
Great point. To the point of then leading and prompting, what is your preparation for an episode?
Yeah, so I like to do an outline, and then I actually like to share the highlights of that with my guests. I don't tell them the specific questions necessarily because then it doesn't feel very organic. But I want them to be prepared, especially if I'm going to ask them for some data. And a lot of my interviews, I'm asking for specific data, and there's odds are they don't have it on the top of their head, right? They might go to their research team and say, hey, can you look this up? How much did we sell in domain names last year? And was it .com or was it something else, right? That sort of thing. So I want them to be prepared rather than stumbling along.
Right.
What's your view, Andrew, of the role of YouTube? Because a lot of the things that are sort of popping up in sort of forums and talking about is the role that we should be using as a podcaster. Obviously podcasting, but equally using YouTube as another way of being able to share your interview.
So from a distribution standpoint, you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I started podcast guests, almost everyone who was inviting guests on there had audio only for their podcast. And now I'd say that's switched to, boy, I almost want to say it's maybe half and half now, right? Where people want to record video. And then of course with Zoom taking off over the past couple of years, I think that's probably caused a lot of that, which brings up 2 points. One, when you're inviting someone to be a guest on your podcast, let them know if there's video as well, because the preparation for that, throwing on a decent shirt and combing your hair is a lot. So mine's still audio only. My wife's is still audio only. It's a lot easier to edit audio only. If you're also doing video, it's probably going to run it separately because you're not going to edit out all the uhs and ums and that sort of thing. But we still go ahead and distribute it to YouTube. And I'm surprised at how many people will go and just listen in the background through YouTube. That is their preferred way of doing it. And that
do you add just like a placeholder image? How do you do that?
It is just a placeholder image through Libsyn.
Okay.
And this is on my wife's I'm thinking about here. And as soon as she publishes it, people start commenting on there. And it's like, it's odd to me, but a lot of people want to have a browser tab open in the background, listening on YouTube. That's just their style. And it gets back to catering to how people like to consume your content, no matter what it is and where it is.
And the other question I had was, how do you differentiate your guest business? Because it's the details earlier that Ethan shared with us, that it's a significant business that you've built through the guest business. How have you differentiated yourself against some of the other competition?
Right. So when I started it, there were no free platforms out there for finding a guest and getting booked as a guest. And so sorry, my dog's going crazy here.
Do you have like an off button on your cell phone for the dog?
Yeah, right.
I wish I knew how to do that with my dog.
This is the joy of being at home. I'm sorry. Can you keep repeating?
No, there's just like different. There are now new businesses that have been set up as guest.
Right. Yeah.
How do you differentiate yourself?
When I started, I was the only one, right? And so I started it because there were a bunch of agencies out there, and they're expensive, right? They're hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars a month. So I said, let me create my own free platform. Now there is some competition out there. Mine was modeled at the top, we said, off of Help a Reporter Out, where it is very based, opposed to direct out of it. It's I send out this email a couple times a week. People expect it, and it really focuses on the podcasters. And so people that use my service tell me, especially if they use the paid option, they tell me they get a lot of inbound requests from the service compared to others where they have to do a lot of outbound requests, because the podcasters can sit back and get those requests that way.
So you've got an email distribution list that you.
Right, exactly. So twice a week, I send out a list of 10 podcasts that are looking for guests, and people can pitch to those. And so the nice thing about that is that when you're a podcaster, and I think the experience on other services is you get a trickle of people pitching to you from time to time, right? With this, when we feature you in the newsletter, you get a lot of pitches all at once, right? And so it's helpful to you if you're trying to book out your calendar for the next few months, or to compare and contrast and get the really good, decide who you want to be a guest on your show. If you get 100 pitches, which some of our podcasts do, that really gives you a lot to choose from.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us just a little bit more detail on the paid service? What's the format? Is it an ongoing subscription? Is it like a one-time thing? How does that work?
Right. So it's a subscription. I have two levels. I have a basic and a premium. And what that does is it gets you included in the directory. So if you're using the free service, what you're doing is you're getting these emails every week and you're pitching the podcasts that are a fit. If you do the paid service, it gets turned around where people can come to you because you have an online one sheet, an SEO-friendly, mobile-friendly online one sheet in the system. Two levels, a basic and a premium. The premium gets you at the top of the list, a few more features, enhancements to your profile, but it also gets you where you can you get included in our newsletters on a rotating basis. So each issue of the newsletter has like 15 people that are from our premium members, and then they tend to get a lot of exposure from that newsletter that goes out. So sometimes I'll get 3, 4, or 5. Some people get 10 invites that day when their email goes out. It really depends a lot on the person, and the pricing there ranges from, if you pay, you can do monthly or annually. So it ranges from like $10 to $39, depending on how you do it per month.
Yeah, cool. It seems like a really interesting opportunity. And
just to clarify, only the guests have paid options. Everyone else everyone else. Sorry. Everyone else is like podcasters never pay to use it. So
right, I'm a user of it, and I like that weekly email or however often it is, and I scan through there and decide if it's somebody I want to pursue. So, but I've been thinking about now as I was preparing for this interview of joining as a potential guest, because like as you said, that's something I haven't explored as deeply as I should, being on other shows to continue growing my show.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion, I'm curious what you guys think, but I think that's the best way to grow your show, because you're getting, 100% of the people listening to that podcast are podcast listeners. And, you've got this conversation with them that if you do a good job, if you educate that audience, they're more likely to then say, oh, let me go check out this person's podcast.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's interesting from my NFT podcasts. We're very busy. I think that's part of it. I've told my co-hosts a lot of what I've learned about podcasts. Going on other podcasts can be really helpful. They seem to be very resistant to actually getting on those other podcasts, right? It just seems like, I don't know what it is. I'm up for it, but I guess our schedules are too packed. But maybe sometime here in the near future, we'll be doing it. One thing that keeps coming up for us, and maybe it's very specific to the space we're in, is like AMAs or Twitter Spaces or these other sort of podcast type things. So I don't know. It remains to be seen. But
remember Clubhouse?
Yeah, Clubhouse.
Remember that? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was with you, like I was thinking, because I was on it relatively early doors and was sort of participating on the Clubhouse. Now, I know that it's not as it's not booming like it was before, but it's interesting. A couple of people that I follow on podcasts are still publishing in Clubhouse and are still participative in Clubhouse. So it will be interesting to see on a sort of longer term whether that audio version of things like Clubhouse, and I know Green Room, Spotify have played with, and Twitter are also trying out this audio space. It will be interesting sort of in another year or a year or two to see how that actually develops and whether that gets some more traction again, or whether that was just a fad in COVID and it's not a long-term solution.
Yeah, I think that, Clubhouse, and they were talking about adding recording to it. I mean, I know you can do it through third-party devices, but that becomes interesting because I could have a conversation with a few people fairly easily, and we could have audience questions. And then if I can package that into a podcast, that makes content creation a lot easier. So I think, I think there's still something there, right? But it is amazing how everyone was on it nonstop 1 year ago, and now it's like I go and I don't know anyone on there anymore. So,
well, it was interesting. Like when it first started, people were going on like 18, 20 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Which was just bonkers. I think now, from what I understand, people are being a little bit more scheduled on their times, and they're doing a show for 2 hours or an hour or whatever it is. But yeah, at one stage, it was like 18-hour shifts on it, and it was it was unsustainable.
It was nuts. There was that FOMO, right? You didn't want to miss out on the key conversation. All your friends were there.
And everybody was home, nothing to do.
Yeah, I think that was part of it.
Hey, Andrew, refresh my memory. I'm on your site now, and I think I'm on your list of podcasts, but where do I go for that? I see where I can join as a guest, but I'm not clear where I go for a podcaster.
Right. So to join as a podcast, you join the same way you join as a guest. The free box you fill out at the top of the page. So we don't publish a directory of podcasts.
Right.
And that's kind of one of our unique differences.
So it's the join 30,000 plus. Is that
exactly?
Okay. So as if I'm joining your newsletter, that's the same place.
That is the on-ramp to it.
Okay.
And then I send out an email that gives you a link to where you can submit your show to be featured in the newsletter.
Got it. That's the part.
And then
I
as a
think I'm in
podcast-
there. So how do I know? Would I have a membership login, or is that's just for guests?
That's only if you have a paid account.
So like, how do I know if I am on your list or not?
Well, so you would have first of all, you would have gotten an email this morning.
I do. Yeah, I did.
Okay. So you're on that list. Now, as far as if you're in the queue to have your podcast featured, you would have submitted it through a form, and we would have gotten back to you within a week or two telling you it was in the queue. And then we'd remind you when we're about to feature it, make sure you still wanted to be featured and that sort of thing.
Okay.
We do now recently added a login for podcasters. If you're inviting people through our directory. So previously, every time you invited someone through the directory, you had to fill out a form that said, with all your information in it. Now you can save that information to make it easier to invite guests in the directory. So you can log in that case. But
and just one thing on that, like, I'm not looking for exact numbers, but how much of those people that have subscribed are free subscribers versus the paid subscribers?
There are about 900 paid and about 35,000 free. So almost everyone's using it for free. And those are the people that are getting these twice weekly newsletters. So, which is great, right? That was the original purpose of it. I added the directory because people asked for it. My original thinking was, hey, let me get this up and running. And then I was like, well, I know how to sell ads. I can sell ads against it. Did that for a while. And then people said, hey, I like this, but I'm having to pitch to all these podcasts, which is great, but it'd be awesome if they could come to me. How can we do that? And then I was like, well, here's some ideas. People said, yeah, that sounds cool. And then so it kind of built from there.
Cool. Well, I want to make sure we just got a couple minutes before the end of the hour. Sometimes we leave a little bit of leeway, but I don't want to guarantee it. So make sure, we've talked about the website and everything, but make sure we cover where we can send people so they can get to know more about what you're up to and what you want them to check out.
Awesome. Yeah. Podcastguest.com. You can go there. You can sign up for free. That'll get you on our twice weekly emails. You'll get a welcome email with more information on how it works. And then if you're interested in domains, which is funny, sometimes I'll go on a podcast to talk about podcasting and it devolves into a discussion about domain names. Go to dnw.com, domainnamewire.com. And you can, again, it's very insider baseball, but some people love that stuff. There are tips and tricks for buying and selling domains. There's news and that sort of thing there. And that's my main Twitter. My main social media presence is Twitter, at Domain Name Wire is my handle. There if you're interested in that stuff.
Very good. That's cool. Yeah, that is a problem when you have multiple things like you have multiple social media accounts.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool. Well, be respectful of your time, and we'll wrap right up here at the hour. And really appreciate you joining. Wish you the best of success with everything you're up to. Feel free to reach out to us as a resource if we can be of any service. We love helping podcasters, and if you have any guests to recommend, we'll have them on here as well.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll do that.
Cool. All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
We'll
Thanks
wrap
so
it up
much,
for today. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Appreciate it.
Catch you later.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Okay.
Bye.